middle, working groups and the IOCA and advisory committees kind of around it.
It's not the planning office, actually, it's just the planning process.
Process, okay. And so that process, you've just identified that the planning office would be a key in there. Somewhere inside there would be the governance. It's almost kind of, I'm just trying to put it in a kind of visual context of how that, who creates the work groups? Because it doesn't look like the connection is there between IOCA and work groups. It looks like it's between a planning process.
One of the responsibilities or roles for the IOAC, which is listed in the engagement strategy, is that there is a chance for discussion around what might some of the working groups be, what are some of the priority issues that are most suitably addressed through something like a working group. But to sort of back up a step, I think there's a few inputs to something like the development of a working group. So again, coming back to what is the role of governments in working in collaboration, in this case with First Nations, part of that role is to identify, based on what we've been hearing and based on some of the work that's been made through things like the issues and opportunities, challenges and opportunities paper, and through some of the meetings that we've been hearing, is to scope out what we think some of the priority issues are, and that we do some of that upfront work, and that comes to a body like the IOAC, where there's a chance for discussion with that sort of thing. So we say, this is what we think some of the priority issues are. What do you think about that? Have we got the priority issues right? Are there others that we really need to address? Are there opportunities to address those? And then are they best addressed through something like a working group? So there's a few stages, I think, in there, but certainly discussion around what kinds of topics need to be the focus of more detailed discussions through working groups or through a workshop is part of what we envision the IOAC's role to include.
So, I'm just one of my concerns is kind of the transparency around the whole process and that kind of thing. And so, from a public perspective, I'm just wondering how, like say the existing advisory bodies, are they brought into the process through direct work with the planning office? Or would they be brought into a meeting with with the IOAC? How do you see that? How does this play out? Just kind of what's the actual mechanisms there? What do you think, or what do you think?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that's something that we can talk a little bit further about in a small group setting. But here are some initial thoughts. In terms of how you go out and you engage with an existing advisory process, I think in large part that exercise is going to be one of the responsibilities as a coordinating body of something like the planning office. So they're the ones who actually go out and initiate the contact with, let's just take for example, the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, and say, within a working group in the PNCIMA process, there have been some recommendations, and we think that based on the work that they're doing and based on the sport fishing representatives or participants that are actually on that working group in the PNCIMA process, we think we've gotten the recommendation in the sense that this needs to be brought out for broader feedback from the sport fishing community. So we would play the role of bringing that work out, inviting comment on it from the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, and then bringing that back into the process. Now the key there in terms of transparency is that the participants within the PNCIMA process who have affiliations or who participate from the Sport Fishing Advisory Board or from the sport fishing sector are also a linkage there, right? So they know that it's going out, they may be sitting at the Sport Fishing Advisory Board so they see what gets presented, and then they also have a role in ensuring that what we bring back in terms of communicating what we heard at the Sport Fishing Advisory Board back into a working group or to the IOAC, that there's some congruency there. And if it turns out that it's an exercise that's better left to a participant with feet in both rooms, then I think that's something we can explore.
Maybe I can just jump in and sort of work this into the next part of the agenda. we've heard some feedback from previous meetings and communities that the participation in the IOAC needs to be enhanced with respect to community representation. We expect communities to take ownership of the process. They need to feel represented at the IOAC. And not a big surprise there. And then we've also heard, with respect to working groups, some potential ideas on what those working groups might focus on. What the Planning Office and the Steering Committee want to do is they'd like to convene the IOAC in June and table some ideas about potential working groups, which would reflect the feedback that has been received from community meetings, including this one today. So that the IOAC said, yeah, we think those are the right kinds of working groups. And maybe there's an additional one that needs to be created, and the terms of reference for those working groups might define the relationship between the IOAC and the working group and how that communication occurs. So on certain types of issues, like, say, a working group on science and traditional knowledge, there might be avenues into all the different mechanisms. Whereas a working group that's focused on a particular area or topic, let's say resolving user and environmental issues in the North Hecate Strait, it's probably unlikely that the IOAC is going to change the outcome of the detailed planning process that occurs with all the interested parties there. So the specific relationships need to be worked out, and what they're hoping to do in the Planning Office is develop a constituency of support in the IOAC for the implementation of the engagement process. So what we need now is to get into those specifics with all of you in relation to the participation on the IOAC and its responsibilities, as well as the types of working groups that you think should be created and why, and then other means of engagement that you think are going to be helpful to make the process work. And all of that is going to inform what they table with the IOAC in June. And some of you may well be there. So if we take a break right now for about 5 minutes, we're going to organize 3 tables, one at the back and one on each side, and members of the Planning Office and the Steering Committee are going to sit with you, walk through these questions, and anything else that isn't covered by the questions, and then each group is going to report out kind of highlights from their discussion. And then anything else that comes up at that time in that last plenary, we can talk about that as well. Okay? So if you'd like to grab another